Hey everyone, this is Dr. Drizzle, and welcome to the National Parks Adventure, Crossing America. Today, we're at Cumberland Island National Seashore in Camden County, Georgia. A special thanks to the National Park Foundation for the collaboration. And we are here with our newest ranger friend, Ranger Robin. Now, Ranger Robin, I am going to share something silly about myself. We are standing near an armadillo hole, and I thought immediately that something was going to come up my britches legs, but you've assured me that we are safe, right?
We'll be fine here, yes ma'am.
Great. Well, Ranger Robin, thank you so much for inviting us here today, for allowing us to be on this very beautiful island that's very unique in a lot of ways. But before we talk about this place, can you tell us how your journey has been to get to the national parks?
Absolutely, thank you all for being here. So for me, I've studied science for quite a long time. I graduated with a degree in environmental science from Georgia College State University, and then spent several years traveling across the country working in the environmental education field in Tennessee, in Nevada. Went to graduate school for geology after that. And then continued doing outdoor education on the coast of Georgia here, just a couple islands up from Cumberland Island on St. Simon's Island. And, you know, got to know some of the rangers here leading field trips out to the island, and the natural progression just led me to the Park Service. And I spent my first season out in Wyoming at Fossil Butte National Monument, and then traveled back down here to Cumberland with a seasonal job, and that was 8 years ago, and they haven't been able to get rid of me yet.
I love that, and what a juxtaposition of places, from Wyoming with snow and elk and all the things, and then down here with armadillo and ocean. So we're glad you're here, because I think this is going to be a very interesting time together. So we're here at Cumberland Island National Seashore. There's a lot of history here. There's a lot of natural resources here. So we're going to let you tell us a little bit about this place.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, Cumberland is really an amazing place. There's nothing else really like it that you can find in the national park system. So Cumberland is a barrier island, meaning it forms between the ocean and the mainland, and it really is a barrier of protection from storms and tide and other events from the ocean. It protects the mainland communities, and so it can be a pretty harsh environment out here. But even so, there's a pretty huge diversity of animals and plants that live out here on this island. So the island itself is large. It's almost 18 miles from top to bottom. At the narrowest point, it's only a half a mile, but at the widest point, it's about 3¼ miles. In totality, it's about 36,000 acres. Wow. So it's a pretty big area. The three main ecosystems we have out here, we've got the Maritime Forest, which you can kind of see off in the distance here, and that has live oak trees and saw palmetto, muscadine, grapevines that hang down, and a bunch of other plants that live in that forest as well. We've got a salt marsh that lives on the back side of the island with really just one type of grass, the Spartina grass, and that salt marsh is a really important, very productive ecosystem, allows for flood control, for water purification, and for a home and nursery and grocery store for a lot of animals that come by there. And then of course we have the beach and the dunes, and the beach on Cumberland Island is just incredible. It's wide open, flat, hard-packed sand. You cross over the beach in some places, the sand dunes are way taller than your head, which is a difficult experience to find on the coast, where development brings hotels and things right up to the coastline. And so we've got a huge, big, mature dune system and beach. And so, you know, those are the three main ecosystems, but the island is big enough that we have several smaller ecosystems as well, like the longleaf pine ecosystem. We've got freshwater wetland areas on the north end, including a 40 to 50 acre lake, depending on how much it's rained. A freshwater lake, and there are some interdune meadows and some freshwater sloughs and some other kind of smaller ecosystems as well to round out the diversity of the ecosystems out here on the island, which is pretty neat.
So since we're talking about ecosystems, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about some of the animals we would find out here.
Yeah, there's a lot of wildlife, great wildlife viewing opportunities. This area we're in now is one of the better spots for wildlife viewing in the historic area because of the wide open spaces. Common things down here are, deer. We have white-tailed deer. We have turkey, wild turkey, armadillos, like you mentioned. Hopefully one will wander by here at some point. And also have the feral horses that were let go by people out here that like this open area. Though we don't have any here, there's evidence of the horses everywhere.
There he is. We're watching our step.
Yeah, and some of the animals that are more rare to find, we've got bobcats, and there's been a sighting of one down here as well. Over 300 species of birds live on the island, so some of those are migratories that just come through. Some are full-time residents out here, so birding is a big pastime for people. Especially the beach provides really vital habitat for a lot of endangered and threatened birds and shorebirds. There are, reptiles, we've got snakes, we've got turtles, not just land turtles like the gopher tortoise, we also have sea turtles that come and nest here. We have the most amount of nests in Georgia of any other beach in Georgia here of the mainly loggerhead sea turtles. Off the coast, we've got dolphin, manatee that come here in the summertime. There's a bunch of fish and sharks and other sea creatures around the island too. So there's a pretty high diversity of wildlife out here on the island.
So when you visit here, you're going to have an experience because you're going to see all the different ecosystems, the animals. Now, we can only get here by water, is that correct?
That's correct. So Cumberland Island has no bridge over to it, and that's part of its enabling legislation. There never will be a bridge, and so it kind of provides a unique avenue for people to get out to the island.
Well, we've talked about the animals, but let's talk about the humans. So how did this place become what it is now? Can you tell us a little bit about the history?
Absolutely. The history of this island is also really fantastic. It dates back a pretty long time. About 4,000 years ago is the earliest indication of native peoples out here on this island. And the native peoples that came out here initially would come out here and hunt and gather plants and animals and take those resources back to primary villages on the mainland. And then roughly 600-700 years ago, the Timucuan native peoples did move out here to this island. One of the names they called it was Miso, which roughly translates to beautiful land or beautiful island, so very appropriately named. And they established permanent villages out here on the island, and including right in this area we're standing right here in what's now the Dungeness Historical District. And they built big mounds of middens and things around and utilized the island resources. As we get closer to the 1600s, Europeans started to arrive. First, the French came and set up a beneficial trade relationship with the native peoples out here, trading for sassafras. The Spanish then arrived, kind of kicking the French out, rudely, to put it lightly, and the Spanish actually established a mission out here on this island, and the mission was called San Pedro de Tecatacuru. So Tecatacuru was the village, San Pedro was the Spanish name for the island. And the village and the mission was somewhere down here as well. No real evidence of it exists because the wooden structures don't last very long here on the coast. And so, but it was a pretty successful mission. It was the missionary hub for this entire kind of southeast Georgia, northeast Florida region. And then the Spanish eventually left in the 1600s, 1680s, and then that left room for the English to keep traveling south along the coast. And James Oglethorpe landed in Georgia in 1733 to establish the colony of Georgia, and he was kind of provoking Spain by moving down into this area. So Oglethorpe built two forts on the island, one on the south end, one on the north end, and those eventually played a role in defeating Spain over control of the Georgia coastline. After that conflict had been settled, the English kind of abandoned the land. They didn't really need the forts here anymore, and it became a no man's land. A lot of native peoples left with the Spaniards, and so it was kind of an empty island for the most part at that point. After the American Revolution, land grants were given out here, and several planters established plantations on the island where they cleared land, sold some of the live oak timber for building ships. Some of that land was cleared to grow cotton using enslaved African labor, which was brought over either from the Caribbean or from Africa. And those people worked in the cotton fields out here to grow Sea Island cotton. A large plantation was right down here. In fact, this that we see here today was a plantation house. It was taller than what you see here today, 60 feet tall, made out of made all out of tabby, which is a coastal concrete using oyster shells, sand, and lime, which was created by burning oyster shells.
Okay.
And so that house was massive here behind us. And during that plantation era, at the peak of it, there were about 450 enslaved Africans on the island, forced to grow cotton and other crops like indigo and rice, and about 20 white landowners here on the island. And things really changed with the coming of the Civil War, the Emancipation Proclamation. A lot of those folks left the island who are now freed. Some of them remained, some of them came back and established little communities on the north end of the island where they kind of lived and eventually had homes and created a settlement up there on the north end. Down here on the south end of the island, the plantation lands were bought up mainly by a wealthy industrial family named the Carnegie family, or the Carnegie family. And they came down from Pittsburgh, Thomas and his young wife, Lucy, and they purchased the property on the south end called Dungeness, tore down that plantation home and built kind of what we see here today, the Dungeness Mansion, and created a estate for them and their family where they would come down here for the winters to get out of the cold of New England and maybe some of the bad air up there in the Industrial Revolution, and they established a really large island estate where they bought up most of the island and built recreational facilities around for the family. Later on in the 1900s, the family came out here less and less, and eventually the trust that had been established to protect the island expired, and the island was being pulled in different directions. Some people wanted to develop it, some people wanted to protect it, and everything in between that you can imagine. And luckily for everyone today, the protection of the island prevailed, and the family sold and donated their property to the National Park Foundation, which eventually transferred it to the National Park Service once the law was passed enabling Cumberland Island on October 23rd, 1972. 50 years ago this year, we're celebrating our 50th anniversary of being a National Seashore today.
Happy anniversary.
Thank you, thank you.
So we had multiple names for this place: Miso, San Pedro, Highlands. How did we get to the name of Cumberland?
Sure. So James, it gets back to the English time when James Oglethorpe was here. In 1736 or so, he went back to England to get more troops and supplies. And as the story goes, he brought with him a couple of native peoples from near Savannah. The chief of the Yamacraw and his young nephew, a boy named Tunahowie. Tunahowie befriended another young man over in England. He was a duke, son of the king, the Duke of Cumberland. And they rode horses together, gave Tunahowie a golden watch, taught him how to tell time. And as the story goes, Tunahowie asked General Oglethorpe to rename this island Cumberland Island after his friend the Duke.
I love that. I love the diversity of this place and the vast amount of peoples that lived here. It's a very interesting history, and we see this Dungeness behind us. Now, did this just start to fall on its own, or was there something that happened to make this ruins?
Good question. Yeah, so the house did burn down. So Dungeness itself, as a mansion for Lucy Carnegie, was closed in 1925, about 10 years after she passed away. And it was very expensive to upkeep the home. The children who were still coming out here had their homes further north on the island that they were living in and visiting. And so to save money in their trust, they closed this house down in 1925. And it started to kind of fall apart to some degree. And then, unfortunately, it did burn down. It was ruled as arson in 1959. And kind of the story with that is during the 1950s, the family wasn't out here all that much, and there were a lot of poachers coming out here to hunt illegally on the island for the deer, the turkey, the alligators, whatever it was at the time. And the Carnegie family hired a few game wardens to discourage these illegal activities. And one particular individual was a repeat offender, allegedly was shot fleeing the island, and then a couple of weeks after he got out of the hospital, the house burned down.
So as you know, we encourage kids to solve global goals. Are there any challenges here that you face as a national park that we can invite these students to collaborate with you on?
Sure, sure. One of the challenges we face here is historic preservation. Preserving these places is part of the mission of the Park Service is to preserve these really amazing historical landmarks for everyone to enjoy. And so Dungeness itself being burned down, it's a little structurally compromised, and so we try and work to stabilize it to some degree, but that's a constant challenge. With some of the buildings that are still buildings and not ruins, that's an additional challenge because we have to maintain those for uses for historic tours. Like Plum Orchard is another good example of that, where we have spent a lot of money and time over the past 15-20 years to protect it from termites, to fix the roof and other issues with those old homes, to preserve it in such a harsh environment like we have here with hurricanes and salt spray and all that kind of stuff that we find here on the coast.
Well, I think we're going to ask some kids to help with that, if that's okay with you.
Sounds great.
All right, kids, so we're going to look at UN Global Goal number 11, which is Sustainable Cities and Communities. The Cumberland Island National Seashore Rangers are asking for your help as they work to preserve these historical structures. So it's different than just remodeling a house, because we're not going to put a hot tub out back, and we're not going to add air conditioning and all the fancy things we may have now in our own homes. We want you to do some research on the historical architecture of these places. We want you to think about how what's happening on the island affects the actual structure, and how can you come up with ideas to help the rangers make sure that they're preserving the look of the historical structure and keeping it safe. Now, also think about the structure behind us. Now, as Ranger Robbins said, they're not going to rebuild this, but they need to stabilize it, because there are people out here on the island that come to bike and to camp and to look around this place. How can they keep this safe so that it just doesn't topple over on somebody? So you may need to think about historical engineering. You're probably going to want to dig into your science books in the physics part and talk about force and motion and what type of structures you can build to stabilize. We want you to share all of these ideas with us at Expeditions in Education. You can also tag the National Park Foundation, hashtag Crossing America, and make sure that you also tag the Cumberland Island National Seashore, and you're going to find those credentials running across the bottom of the screen. I'm excited about this, Ranger Robin, because we may have some future architects and engineers that are watching today that may even come and work for you someday.
Sounds great. I'm looking forward to see what they come up with.
So we know that students love to learn about these parks, and they love to solve challenges for the parks, but they also are thinking in the back of their head, I want to wear that flat hat someday. So can you look into the middle camera and just give them a little bit of advice how they could come here one day and work for you?
Absolutely. I'm very excited that anyone will be interested in working with the Park Service, because there's a lot of wonderful jobs all over the place. One of the things that helped me, without even me knowing about it, was spending a lot of time in the outdoors as a kid. Getting outside, just looking around the space that you've got and developing a connection with your own place can help when you move to other places around the country to learn about those special places and help tell their story as well.
So our kids love to talk, so being able to be a park ranger might be just down their alley, because I've never met a park ranger that doesn't like to talk.
That's true. Sometimes we talk too much.
No, that's okay. So thank you so much for sharing that with our students. We know that the National Park Service sites are just, each one of them is a page in our history book that we can learn from. So thanks so much for having us here today, and we can't wait again to see what these kids create.
Absolutely. You're very welcome. I'm glad y'all had a chance to come by.
Yeah, and no armadillos ran up my pants leg, so we're really excited about that. Although I have stepped in some remains of the horses. So
That's just chewed up grass. You'll be fine.
Okay, that sounds good. All right, kids, well, thank you so much for joining us today at Cumberland Island National Seashore. A special thanks to the National Park Foundation for your support. So on behalf of Dr. Drizzle and Ranger Robin, we are out of here. Have a great day.